If you were to ask someone, what does evolution mean? You might hear someone say something similar to this. This is a popular statement about, has been viewed as somewhat kind of a definition of evolution, which we read last night, if I remember correctly. But there is a theory that all the living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic or non-living form. This theory can be called the general theory of evolution. And I was teaching in a public school. I've done that a few times the last few years, believe it or not. And I think I mentioned to you last night that I was back in Oklahoma at my hometown and the high school that I grew up in. And we were talking some about this. And one young lady, she raised her hand and she said, well, no one thinks of evolution as a fact. It's a theory. And I said, well, that's interesting that you say that, because a lot of the leading evolutionists over the last few decades, they have indicated that evolution, as we defined it a moment ago, is a fact. Like apples falling out of trees, said Dr. Stephen Jay Gould. You probably have heard that name before in Newsweek magazine a few decades ago. Thomas Hayden wrote in U.S. News and World Report a few years ago a cover story titled The New Reality of Evolution. Notice where we came from, where we're going. And he said, by now, scientists say evolution is no longer just a theory. It's an everyday phenomenon, a fundamental fact of biology, as real as hunger and as unavoidable as death. And let me tell you, hunger's a real thing, isn't it? I mean, I know we can say that kind of lightheartedly because we live in such a prosperous country and we eat. I mean, you all have fed me so well. I mean, between the snacks last night and being with Blue Ones this weekend and having all sorts, we awakened today to hickory smoked bacon and eggs and toast. And I got the best sleep last night, I think, that my wife and I, that we've had in a long time. It's like a bed and breakfast at their house. Let me tell you, out in the woods. And then we had another good meal, great meal this afternoon after that late breakfast. And honestly, I feel like I've already gained a few pounds since I've been here. But all that said, you know how real hunger is. We all know how unavoidable death is if the Lord Jesus does not come back first. And allegedly, that's how factual evolution is. Michael LePage wrote in 2008 in New Scientist magazine, evolution is as firmly established a scientific fact as the roundness of the earth. That's allegedly how factual this is. I have with me tonight this textbook that's been used in different places around the country. This is a middle school textbook that was used as probably a 9-week unit study called Evolution, Change Over Time. We're going to be referring to that a few times tonight. There's a book over here, I think there might still be one left, called Truth Be Told, exposing the myth of evolution, where we have a lot of information that I'm dealing with tonight, as well as a book that is on dinosaurs. This is how, let me just illustrate to you, giving you an example that's a few years old now, but illustrate to you how serious evolutionists are about keeping, any kind of doubt away from it. So just bear with me here as I mention that a few years ago in Cobb County, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta, Georgia, there was a school board there in Cobb County, the Cobb County School Board, who decided they were going to put this sticker in the front of science textbooks, similar to this one, for example. And the sticker is what you read on the screen behind me. This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Boy, what a terrible, terrible sticker, right? That's... Really? Is it really that bad to have a sticker like this in the front of text? Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. I was actually teaching in Cobb County, Georgia, after all of this happened, and got to speak to the gentleman who actually showed up at a seminar, who was the leading one, along with the ACLU, who filed a lawsuit seeking the Cobb County School Board to remove the stickers from the textbooks. What's so bad with the stickers? What's wrong with them? Well, in April of 2004, a federal judge refused to dismiss the lawsuit on behalf of the school board because the disclaimer could have the effect of advancing religion. It could have the effect of advancing religion in Cobb County, Georgia, and supposedly we wouldn't want that to happen. He stated, he admitted this, while the disclaimer has no biblical reference, it encourages students to consider alternatives other than evolution. Does this have a ring of brainwashing in it? I mean, it's like, hey, evolution cannot be questioned. If you question evolution, you're teaching religion, supposedly, and we can't have people questioning this and thinking of any alternatives other than what we're telling you. That's not how, by the way, that's not how Bible teaching works. I can tell you, I can tell other people, this is why I believe that God exists. And these are evidences that should prove to someone that God exists. And these are evidences that should show someone that the Bible is of supernatural origin and not from the minds of mere men. And here are evidences for and passages of Scripture that we can consult if we believe that God exists and the Bible is His Word to tell us why we should follow the Lord Jesus Christ and become members of His church. And we can make, but ultimately, you make that decision. I mean, I'm not going to force you, and there's no Christian who's going to force someone else, nor, although we want to give people good information and we encourage people to meditate on good things, I welcomed my kids learning about the theory of evolution because I know they're going to grow up in a world where this is a prominent theory, and so I want them to be aware of it. And I wasn't afraid of them being carried away with it because I've even though I understand that's possible because every person has his or her own free will, they know the truth of the matter. The devil, the Bible says, walks about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. I can't deny that because that's what the Bible says that he does. And we can't live our lives in fear of the devil. We know the truth. The truth sets you free, and the truth has nothing to fear. The truth has nothing to fear. When I read statements like this, I can't help but think these people seem to be scared silly. About, hey, we can't allow anything else in here. It's like, here is the story that we're going to tell, and don't listen to what anyone else has to say. We're not even going to talk about it. It's not even up for discussion. U.S. District Judge Clarence Cooper said, the sticker also has the effect of implicitly bolstering alternative religious theories of origin by suggesting. Now, the sticker didn't say anything about religion, didn't say anything about God, didn't say anything about the Bible or Genesis or creation or Jesus, etc. By suggesting that evolution is a problematic theory even in the field of science, by denigrating evolution. Well, can't have that. The school board appears to be endorsing the well-known prevailing alternative theory, creationism or variations thereof, even though the sticker does not specifically reference any alternative theories. I mean, can we not just ask a question? I don't take offense when someone asks me, Eric, why do you believe that God exists? Eric, do you really think that God exists? Eric, why do you think that the Bible is the Word of God? Eric, why would you believe that Jesus is the promised, prophesied, fulfilled those prophecies Messiah who walked on earth 2,000 years ago? Hey, I understand why people ask those questions, because many people who don't grow up in a Christian home, they logically want to know, hey, what's going on here? Why would you believe such things? Well, there's a lot of problems with the theory of evolution that a lot of evolutionists do not want to talk about. I mean, think about this sticker. It contains material on evolution. I mean, that's what it says. And evolution is a theory, not a fact regarding the origin of living things. This particular sticker was talking about the origin of life. We talked about this last night in our second hour together. Is there any proof that life evolved by time and chance and billions of years from non-life? The science says the exact opposite of that, and yet you can't even put a sticker in a textbook that says evolution is a theory, and not even a good theory, by the way, about how life got here. It's not a fact. The law of biogenesis, as we talked about last night, says that in nature all life comes from previous life of its own kind in nature. So it begs the question, how did the first life get here? Atheistic, naturalistic evolution cannot logically explain that. We quoted Professor Robert Hazen last night, who is one of, if not the leading atheistic evolutionary scientist in the world, in a 24-lesson course that he taught on origin of life, and he said, in essence, I don't have a clue how it happened. No one does. I spent 10 years, he said, studying this, and we don't know how life got here. You know why he said that? Because every single piece of evidence he knows does not show that life could ever come from non-life. That's what the law of biogenesis says. The very opposite of what evolution teaches. And here were, moms and dads, citizens of Cobb County, Georgia, that said, we're going to put a sticker on the front of textbooks that say this is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. And by the way, we want to study it with an open mind, carefully and critically. Isn't that a good way to, think and study? I think about Bible study. Should I go to the Bible and think, I know what everything means already. I know exactly how I should act. I'm going to the Bible to prove what I think I should think about how I should act. That's a terrible way to study the Bible. We need to ask God, let God reveal to us in His Word how we need to conduct ourselves. And this is really a great statement about studying anything, isn't it? Study it with an open mind. You study it carefully. We don't want to, be. We want to be careful not to misinterpret something. When you have a conversation with someone, if you don't listen very well, husbands, you can misinterpret easily what your spouse says or a friend says. So you want to listen more carefully. Otherwise, you might get an elbow to the rib cage or something like that. Hey, are you listening to what I'm saying? Oh, yeah, sure, yeah, yes. No, that's not even the right answer to the question. What question? Well, the question I asked you, 2 minutes ago. Are we listening? Are we thinking critically? God wants us to have our minds focused in Bible study and worship. Well, when it comes to anything, if it's worth spending our time studying, shouldn't we study it carefully, critically, and why wouldn't we study it with an open mind? Everyone has their own backgrounds, has their own experiences. Your experiences are different than my experiences. And so when we come together to study something, we have these innate biases. Well, as much as possible, we want to say, hey, I don't want to be biased in this subject matter. I just want to follow truth. Some people might be biased that 2 + 2 is 5. Some people might be biased that 2 + 2 is 3. Some people might be biased that 2 + 2 is 4 because that's the way that they were raised to do math, and that's how they learned it. There might be 3 biases, but there's only one correct answer, and it just so happens that one person had a bias toward the right answer. His bias did not make him right. The truth is the truth, regardless of whether someone is biased toward it or not. Well, let me move on here as we think about, hey, this really wasn't that bad of a sticker, but unfortunately it was declared unconstitutional, and the school board, and this kind of thing happens all over the country, where they are not going to continue to fork over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in fees and in consultation fees, as well as having attorney fees. And so a lot of times they just kind of throw up their hands and they give up. I was talking to a teacher down in the Pensacola, Florida area a few years ago, and she said that the Freedom from Religion Foundation, headed up by Dan Barker and his co-president, came down there and was threatening to file a lawsuit against the school board if they didn't do X, Y, and Z. And she was told as a teacher in that county that they could no longer pray for their food in the lunchroom when the students were present. Like private prayers. I'm thinking to myself, first of all, you can pray with your eyes open and you don't have to bow your head to pray. I'm not saying that's not a good habit or custom to do as you revere and show respect to God. But listen, I can stand in a room with my eyes open and looking straight at a brick wall, and I can give God thanks for a beautiful day or for my food. That's not to say I'm ashamed to pray with my eyes closed. I'm saying there's not anything in Scripture that says that you have to. So it's crazy to me to think that someone could actually say you can't pray privately when there are kids who are present. But that's how far this has gone in different places around the country. So, what about these alleged proofs of evolution? I mean, if you can't put a sticker in the front of textbooks, for example, Cobb County, Georgia, that says, hey, this is a theory, not a fact regarding the origin of living things, then show me, what are the alleged evidences of evolution? I mean, again, here's a book, and the entire textbook is on evolution, change over time. Now, the word evolution is not a bad word in and of itself. Evolution simply means it comes from a Latin word, evolvere, means to unroll, to unfold, to change. The word change in and of itself is not a bad word. I'm changing. My hair is going from black to gray. I don't know what's going on with my wife's hair. It's like it won't change to gray. I've wondered if there's some hair color going on there. I'm not really sure. I just know my hair, she's looking at me like, I can't believe you would even think about saying that in front of people. Okay? My waistline is bigger than it used to be. I have more wrinkles than I used to have. So I'm changing, all right? Kids grow up from a small infant and to a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, and they change. Change is not bad. But generally speaking, as we began this lecture, evolutionists are referring to change from one totally different kind of animal or creature into another totally different kind over hundreds of millions of years. And that's what this book is talking about, and that's what kids learn about in school. So what we're going to look at for the next few minutes here, what are some of these big, long-time evidences that allegedly prove that evolution is true? So let me tell you about the English peppered moth. Now, again, we could have talked more about the law of biogenesis, but we talked more about that last night. So, just say right up front, that sticker should have never been, disqualified, because it's absolutely true that evolution really is not even a good theory regarding the origin of living things. It's not a fact. And that is just so obvious. Again, that's what the law of biogenesis says. Bio meaning life, genesis meaning beginning, the beginning of life. Life in nature comes from previous kinds of life of the same kind. And again, we elaborated on that last night. So what are some of these so-called evidence? I mean, this is only about a 100-page book. So let me just tell you, this was probably used, if I remember correctly, in a middle school class, probably 6th, 7th, or 8th grade science. And you have a whole unit on evolution. So what are some of the proofs of evolution? Well, this particular one about the English peppered moth has been in textbooks for literally decades now. Decades, all right? So I'm going to read straight from this textbook about the English peppered moth population and how in the 1850s, most of the peppered moths near Manchester, England, were gray in color. Only a few black moths existed. Because the gray moths were almost the same color as the tree trunks on which they lived, they were nearly invisible to the birds that hunted them for food. So you had a lot more of the lighter colored moths than the darker colored moths, and supposedly the birds could more easily see the darker colored moths on the tree trunks on which they landed and lived. That's how the story goes. And so they ate more of the darker colored moths than the lighter colored moths. And then, next paragraph in our textbook here, it talks about how as more factories were built in the area, soot from the chimneys blackened the tree trunks. The gray moths could now be seen against the tree trunks. The few surviving black moths, however, now blended in with the tree trunks. As a result, they survived. Notice this goes back to textbooks at least to 1978, and I think prior to that, here is an example of, you can't even see the darker colored moth, can you? Because this is supposedly proof of evolution. Dr. Kettlewell of Oxford University in the United Kingdom introduced the peppered moth theory, or this story, as evidence of evolution by way of natural selection back in the mid-1950s. Since then, it has appeared in, tons of biology text as evidence of evolution. But there's a couple of big problems with this story. Let me see if I can get to them here. First of all, these moths do not live or rest on tree trunks normally. And yet that's kind of the whole idea here, is that they lived on them. Very few of these moths have been seen resting on tree trunks in the past 60 plus years. Kettlewell actually glued 2 dead moths on a tree trunk to take the now famous photographs. Since then, it has appeared in many biology texts as evidence for evolution. Furthermore, his results have never been replicated. You know, if we did an experiment here tonight and we got these results, and then we came to a particular conclusion, and we wrote about that conclusion of our results from the experiment, and then people all over the world did the exact same experiment and never came up with the same results that we did, what would happen to our experiment, our test, our results, our conclusions? They would be what? They would be discarded. They would be discredited. They would be shown, well, there was something wrong in your theory, your hypothesis, your test. And yet, it's never been replicated, and it's been in textbooks for years. And so there is the question, why? Why has this been in textbooks for literally decades? Still been in textbooks. And it's not just in middle school textbooks. You can find it in high school textbooks. You can find it in college texts. Listen, there are times that we'll go around the country and we'll talk to different ones about this. And we at Apologetic Express, we deal with a lot of different topics. And we have some books over here about the trustworthiness of the Bible, alleged Bible discrepancies, the inspiration of the Bible. We deal a lot with the nature of Jesus Christ, the deity of Christ, evidences for the existence of Christ. But we also deal with this subject matter, which oftentimes with younger people especially is a really big deal because they hear so much about this in school. And I can't tell you how many times we have heard young people say, they'll be at our church camp, for example. We do an Apologetic Express week of camp during the summer down in Alabama, right outside, about 40 minutes from Birmingham, Alabama. And we'll have kids say, hey, that stuff we learned in Bible camp about creation and about evolution, I was just in class today, and they'll write us about the English peppered moth and about how the teacher was telling them this is somehow proof of evolution. But wait a minute, the way the story is told, it's not even true. So why is it in the textbooks at all? And so there was one writer, Jonathan Wells, who wrote a book, a very good book that I highly recommend called Icons of Evolution, where he asked a Canadian textbook writer, why is this in the textbooks? And as I recall, he has it documented in his book that the Canadian textbook writer Bob Ritter said, well, you have to look at the audience. How convoluted do you want to make it for the first-time learner? Like, hey, we can't make evolution complicated. We don't want them to, get all confused about this. We got to make it simple. This is simple. That's why we use it. I mean, that seems to be the idea. Okay, but it's wrong. It's made up. It's not true. Yeah, but it's not convoluted. Well, it's a lie. What do you mean? The advantage of this example of natural selection is that it is extremely visual. Yeah, I can think of a lot of visual things. I mean, right now I'm picturing of an alien sitting on a piece of cheese that's flying through the air. I mean, that's visual, isn't it? I mean, we're not too far from Halloween. Haven't you seen some funny things around here, right? I mean, you can think of all sorts of visual things. So what? And I say that, with kindness in my heart. I'm just a little frustrated about this. Are you kidding me? We're just going to leave this in the textbooks. And by the way, your tax dollars are what pay for these, untruths and lies and false teachings to be spread. I'm not saying we shouldn't pay taxes. Okay, I understand that 2,000 years ago, the Roman government was doing a lot of terrible things, and Jesus still said, give taxes to whom taxes are due. Yes, I'm thinking of Jesus' statement there in Matthew 20, whose inscription is on this coin, and he said Caesar's. Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are gods. He said, we want to get across the idea of selective adaptation. Later on, high school students, can look at the work critically. Sure, but that doesn't happen. It's like, what are you saying there, Mr. Ritter, that we're going to just kind of tell them whatever in middle school and then they can learn the truth about it later? But they don't. I can't tell you how many science teachers who are even Christians or creationists who have not heard some of the truths about these things. And they just have assumed that the textbook writers got it right. But what happens oftentimes are the textbook writers, they just are copying from previous texts and kind of all assuming that it's right. Let me also stop here and say, what if everything about this example was actually true? I mean, everything they say about it. What does that prove? I mean, you and I know that some animals live and some animals die. And we know that sometimes there may be more of this kind or color of animal than this kind or color of animal. But did the English peppered moth ever change into a woodpecker or any other kind of animal? It always remained an English peppered moth, regardless of how few or how many that there were. I don't know of any creationist who don't understand that natural selection is real and that creatures can adapt in different times and different locations for different reasons. You can have penguins that live in a zoo in Montgomery, Alabama. I mean, that's a long ways from Antarctica. You can have polar bears that live in zoos where, I realize they may try to make them fairly comfortable. My point is they can adapt not living in the Arctic to living down in the southeastern part of the United States. They don't, kind of wig out and say, I can't adapt to this. I'm not a big fan of cold weather. I'm really not. But, I survived one weekend in Fairbanks, Alaska when it was minus 40 degrees below zero. Now, I got sick as a dog. David, the last day I was preaching there on Sunday, I got up and I was showing slides. I was talking like this. And I had the preacher, I said, can you please read my slides and I will try to fill in the gaps between them. I got sick as a dog. I don't particularly like cold weather. I had the time of my life in one sense going down the Colorado River this last end of April, 1st of May. But I'm not a fan of cold weather. And the first day we got on the Colorado River for 8 days and 8 nights, it sleeted on us, was as cold as all get out. My toes took literally an hour to defrost. I mean, I thought they were just gone. I didn't know. When am I going to feel my toes again? But my dad and mom, I was telling the Blue Ones, I believe it was today, they did mission work in Murmansk, Russia, 150 miles above the Arctic Circle for a part of 20 years. I mean, they went back and forth, but my dad, he was there, and my mom's sometimes as well, in the middle of winter where it's dark 24 hours a day and it is cold. So, you know what? My mom and dad don't necessarily like that kind of cold weather, but they can, if humans can adapt to it, you think a polar bear can? You think a penguin can? I'm not saying that they are as smart as humans. I'm saying animals are able to do some serious adapting to their surroundings. And of course, a hungry lion in the safari in Africa is going to more easily catch a 3-legged gazelle than a 4-legged gazelle. The 3-legged gazelle, it's as if nature is kind of weeding out, you might say, the 3-legged gazelles. Okay? Just to use a very elementary kind of example. So no one says that that's, everybody agrees that those things happen, but that doesn't prove that you came from ape-like creatures millions of years ago. Or that those ape-like creatures came from reptiles, or that the reptiles came from fish that flopped out of the water. There's no evidence of that, and selective adaptation and natural selection does not prove that whatsoever. Ernst Haeckel said the turning point in his thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1860. Ernst Haeckel is famous for coming up with the idea of embryonic recapitulation, just a fancy word that deals with the embryo inside of the mother, whether human being or an animal, allegedly goes through the evolutionary stages of our forefathers. All right? By the way, let me stop here and say this. We understand, let me just go back for a minute because I kind of missed this point that I want to make sure we make. And that is that you and I understand that change happens and that you can have changes in the peppered moths, for example, or you can have changes within kinds of creatures. And we sometimes call that microevolution. I firmly believe in microevolution. Listen, I have a dog who's half of a weenie dog, half Springer Spaniel. Okay, the people who gave it to us called it a spring weenie. Because they were kind of making it sound good. He's a mutt, okay? But you know, that spring weenie is not anything but a dog. He's not a cat. He's not a deer. He's not a hippopotamus. He's just a breed, not even a breed, just a mutt of a dog. But he's our dog, and we, bless his little heart. Okay, he's been around for 12 years now. And he's probably sulking at home because we're not there, and all the kids are grown, and they're not there, so he's kind of home alone, and my parents go and help him out and feed him every now and then. And I think my dad kind of likes playing with him. But here's the thing. You can have changes within the dog kind. You can have changes within the cow kind. Christians and creationists believe that, know that. But as far as macroevolution, again, those moths have never changed into anything other than moths. You might have, again, different colors. You might have some genetic variations within the moth kind, but they're still moths. What about this idea of embryonic recapitulation, or the embryo retracing the steps of our supposed evolutionary ancestors? Well, Haeckel is famous for his set of drawings that supposedly showed this, that he drew back in the 1870s, where you have different animals and a human being here at the end that allegedly went through these different evolutionary stages of a fish stage with gills, of an anthropoid stage with a tail, and then what we are supposedly today. Here's a similar picture again. This has been around for a long time. The top left-hand corner here, I'll just read you a little from the textbook that says, as you can see, the embryos of a fish, chicken, rabbit, and human appear almost identical in their early stages. What does this mean? Hey kids, what does this mean? And this is what they tell them. Similarities in the embryos of different organisms indicate that these organisms share a common ancestor. Is that really what that says? Is that really what that proves? That is, these organisms all share a common heritage. The similarities in the early stages of embryo development are further evidence that the living things have evolved from earlier living things, and that many living things share a common ancestor, etc., etc. Allegedly, this is proof that you and I and all of the animals around us, that we all came from a common ancestor hundreds of millions of years ago. Problem is that this is how he drew these creatures years ago, and this is what we now know these same animals and the human looks like at the stages that he drew them. Here are the actual pictures and what they actually look like, and this is how he drew them. In his work, The Human Body, Sir Arthur Keith said, nearly 100 years ago now. This is how long we've known this. It was expected that the embryo would recapitulate or retrace the features of its ancestors from the lowest to the highest forms in the animal kingdom. Now that the appearance of the embryo at all stages is known, the general feeling is one of disappointment. The human embryo at no stage is anthropoid in appearance. We know that we've known this for nearly 100 years now, if not longer. Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, in an article that appeared in Natural History not that long ago, just 22 years ago, but notice how long this has been going on. He said Haeckel remains most famous today as the chief architect and propagandist for a famous argument that science, you see, science and evolution are two different things. That science disproved long ago, but that popular culture has never fully abandoned. And so, I mean, this is pretty much a page worth of material about alleged embryonic evolution, embryological evolution of animals and the human being. Stephen Jay Gould went on to say, we should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks, but we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling. He's just flat out admitting, this is one of the most well-known evolutionists of the last 100 years. And he says there's just been a bunch of mindless recycling about this stuff that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not majority, of modern texts. Alleged evolution that is not proof of evolution whatsoever. You know, just a page before this, you have a very popular alleged proof of evolution that's talked about. And you have, let's see, well, nearly 2 whole pages that is dealing with this anatomical similarities. Sometimes the word homology is used for these homologous structures. So they go from, before they talked about the similarities in embryo development, they just talked about similar anatomical structures in your anatomy and the anatomy of animals. And so they show an illustration of a human forearm, the wing of a bat, the flipper of a whale, and the leg of a dog. And they begin on page 51 talking about this and how, this was beginning to be talked about back in the early 1800s. And this is what they say, some things like this. Look closely at the structure of the bones in the bat's wing, dog's foreleg, whale's fin, human's arm. Do you see any similarities? You should, because similarities do exist. These similarities indicate that each organism has evolved from a common ancestor. So there they are. These similarities, that's what, oftentimes, here is what has gone on with the so-called proofs of evolution. Is you say, well, here it is. And you're like, well, okay, And let me back up one moment here for a minute about the embryos. What if there were or are similarities in embryos of human beings and certain animals at various stages? What if there were similarities? How does that prove that we came from the same creature millions of years? It doesn't prove that. That's the story that they tell, if it was even true, and it's nothing like they act like it is. Kind of going back with the peppered moth idea. And so now let's go to these so-called anatomical similarities. Okay. And let me just use my dog as an example again. Are there similarities between me and my dog? Absolutely. Absolutely. He has a tongue. It's hanging out of his mouth a lot more than I think my tongue hangs out of my mouth. But he has a tongue and I have a tongue. He has a mouth and I have a mouth. He has a nose and I have a nose. He has hair and I have hair. I think he has quite a bit more than I have, but okay. He drinks water, I drink water. We drink the same water, actually. I don't drink out of his bowl, but the same water that I pour into his bowl, sometimes I will take a big cup of water and about half of it first goes in the coffee maker, okay? And then it goes into his bowl. We drink the same water. We breathe the same air. Can you believe that? He has to have some of the same systems. You have a nervous system. You have a skeletal system. You have other kinds of, you have a digestive system. You know what? So does he. Got a lot of similarity. For animals and humans to live on the same planet, to drink the same water, to breathe the same air, to walk in the same backyard on the same grass, to live in the same house, there are going to be similarities. But what do those similarities, what do they actually, do they really prove what they contend that they, what they say is, this indicates we evolved from a common ancestor. And the fact of the matter is, that is not an A plus B equals C kind of proof. I could just as easily say God exists because animals and humans have similarities, which proves that there is a common creator of animals and humans. I mean, I could say that, but I don't use that as an argument for God because I think that seems like a weak argument to me. However, I will say this. Well, let me get back to that in just a moment. Let me mention this to you. Do you know that scientists know that the nematode worm is so genetically similar to humans that of the 5,000 best-known human genes, 75% have matches in the worm. So when you hear things like, well, we're 98% like apes, that means we came from apes. No, that does not mean that we came from apes. By the way, just a 1 or 2 or 3 or 10% difference is a huge difference. Scientists know that genetically speaking, we are 75% similar to the nematode worm. You can find this information out probably just by Googling it, by the way. You can also find it on the AP website. Scientists a few years ago were stunned to find out that sea sponges, which allegedly are like hundreds of millions of years old. I'm talking about allegedly evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. Okay, so if humans, according to their theory, came along 2 or 3 million years ago, and sea sponges allegedly evolved hundreds of millions of years ago, did even evolutionary scientists think that sea sponges and humans would be very similar genetically speaking? No, they didn't. And then they found out that sea sponges share almost 70% of human genes. Y'all ever heard of SpongeBob? Uh-huh. That cartoon might have been a little more scientifically accurate than you thought, didn't it? You see, similarities, they really don't prove anything. Although I would contend this. If God is a merciful God, if God exists, and we talked about that last night, as we talked about creation by a creator, makes perfect sense in light of what we know, in light of reason, in light of science. If God exists, could He, for merciful reasons, have made, in addition to just logical reasons like drinking the same water, eating the same food, whether it's plants, fruit, or meat, or having similarities that there are going to be similarities between us and them? Yes. But also, could it be for very merciful reasons that God made especially certain animals to have a lot of similarities with humans physically, anatomically speaking? Well, let me ask you this. Any of you don't raise your hand, but I'm guessing in a group this size, we have a number of people who are on some kind of medication. Are you glad that medication was tested before you started taking that medication? Oh yeah, because it could be really, really, like not good at all if you were the first. We call them guinea pigs, right? Guinea pigs actually exist, by the way. There really are guinea pigs. And two, there are a number of different kinds of animals, especially mice and rats, that are used, that scientists test things on before they ever come into human trial, you might say. I'm not saying that everything that goes on behind the scenes is a good thing. I'm just saying, the medication that you are on, or I'm on, or my family members are on, am I thankful? You should be. That wouldn't even make any sense of testing various medicines on an animal for possible human consumption if those animals were nothing like us whatsoever. I was in Texas just about 3 weeks ago, and I had a gentleman come up to me, and he said, "Eric, I have one relative who has a valve in his heart that's from a pig." But what if pigs had no similarities with humans? Well, then you certainly wouldn't have the option of having a valve in your heart from a pig. He said, I have another family member who has a bladder in his body from a pig. That kind of gives us, maybe a new thought about pigging out about things. I mean, it's like, hey, that guy's pigging out. You know what I'm saying? Listen to this. When I was in high school, I loved to play ball. And I loved to play all sorts of sports in school. I really loved basketball. I wasn't the tallest guy, the quickest, the best shooter, but I loved to play. And I was point guard on my team and just loved the game. I loved the teamwork of it all. I loved other sports too. And I wound up tearing my left anterior cruciate ligament my junior year and my right anterior cruciate ligament, or ACL, my senior year. And I had a doctor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, named Dr. Merriman. Went to him the first time. He said, listen, you've torn your anterior cruciate ligament, and it crushed me. I was going to be out for at least 6 months kind of thing. And he said, okay, here are the options. And this is how I remember the discussion going. He said, listen, we can replace that anterior cruciate ligament with a part of, one of your, I think it was a part of the hamstring area. But that's not the surgery that he necessarily recommended. He said, we can take it from a cadaver. He said, your actual ACL. He said, we can, and the surgery that he, I think, was most comfortable with and liked to perform is taking a part of your patella tendon, like slicing 1/3 of it, and then screwing it in the place where your anterior cruciate ligament. I told y'all last night, I get kind of squirmish talking about this stuff, so this is about as far as I'm going to go. And then, as I recall, he said, or you can get a tendon from a goat. I said, nah, I do not want that. I do not want. But I mean, if that was goats, if they didn't have, have you seen a goat jump around and stuff? I probably should have gone the way of the goat. But my point is, when it comes to this idea of homology, or homologous structures, similar anatomical features. Okay, yes, my dog has joints, he has legs. As I was talking to someone last night, they were like, I can't remember who it was that was saying this to me. They said, if we came from monkeys, I'm kind of disappointed I don't have a tail, because it would have been fun having a tail like a monkey. Actually, here is what most atheistic evolutionists would say is that, well, we didn't actually come from monkeys. We came from ape-like creatures, and the monkeys came from them, and this group came from them, and that group came from them, and we came from them, supposedly. The fact is, brothers and sisters, of all of the so-called proofs in this book or others about evolution, none of them are actual proofs of evolution. You get to the end of this book, and you read about how there is, I'm reading directly from this book. There is no doubt among scientists, however, that humans evolved from common ancestors. They share with other living primates. Scientists also know that the human species evolved in Africa and separated, and then spread around the earth. They say scientists like all scientists believe this, but that's simply not the case. There are thousands of scientists around the world that do not believe that our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, etc., were ape-like creatures. But yes, atheistic evolutionary scientists, they do believe that. But I'm here to tell you there's no proof of that. Well, Eric, isn't there fossil evidence for that? Oh, there's fossil evidence. There's fossils in the ground. But what is the story behind those fossils? The story that evolutionists tell is, well, this fossil fits with this this timeline, and this must be the great-great-great-grandparent of this creature, and this creature evolved into this creature that eventually evolved into human beings. Well, let me give you one example, and then we're going to take a break here. Just one example. A few years ago, I had a friend who was a public school teacher, and he got this Current Science magazine to hand out to his students. And on page 12, they dealt with Ardipithecus ramidus cadaba. I don't know why they can't just call him Bob or Rick or Eric or something, but Ardipithecus ramidus cadaba, which there was a big cover story, I think it was in Time magazine, where they had this creature illustrated. Here's a little illustration of him here. And whenever you see here's here's how apes became human, allegedly. Here's your ancestor going back a few million years ago in Africa. Whoa, have you ever gotten that in the mail or seen that at the grocery store or something? You're like, well, wait a minute, what kind of proof do they have for that? Well, let me just read to you what they're teaching kids here. The bones and teeth of a newfound species, this was several years ago, in the forest of Africa 5.8 million years ago could be the remains of the oldest human ancestor ever found. I'll skip some of it and just read this part to you. So where is the evidence? Like, I want to know why you say this is our ancestor. What's the evidence? Working from the bones and teeth of Kadaba, the ones who illustrated this, they sketched a portrait of a creature that stood 1.2 meters tall, 4 feet, the height of a modern chimpanzee. Okay, I'll file that away. That's the height of a chimpanzee. Kadaba's brain was the size of a chimp's too. Okay, so it's as tall as a chimp. The brain was the size of a chimp. And its body was similarly proportioned, like that of a chimp. So it's the size of a chimp, proportioned like a chimp, the brain size of a chimp. Unlike chimps, however, Kadaba was probably bipedal. It walked upright much of the time. The end. And you know, when you go to the literature to find out, the scientific literature, or maybe even some of the more layman literature like you might find in Time magazine where they report on some of this stuff. Okay, wait a minute. The brain is the size of a chimp. Its body was the size of a chimp. It's proportioned like that of a chimp, but it walked upright, so it had to be on its way to becoming a human. And how do you know it walked upright? By the way, my dog can almost walk upright sometimes. It's not on the way to becoming, I can hold it, and he's a half weenie dog. It's really hard on him, you know what I'm saying? And so you can look this up, Ardipithecus ramidus Kadaba. You know why? They found, how many bones are in your feet? 26 in each foot, unless you have a bone or two missing or one additional one for some reason. But the average human being has 26 bones in each foot. That's 52 bones if my math is correct. They found one toe bone, separated some 10 miles away from the rest, that they said in the literature that was probably dated to be about 100,000 years in age difference than some of the other bones. But that one toe bone proved that creature walked upright, which proved that this is our alleged human ancestor. Here's, to put it very simply as we close here, all the fossils that are in the fossil record, yes, there's a lot there. We can talk about the percentages and stuff later, 90-something percent, 95+%, they're marine fossils. But they're either they're animals or they're humans. They're all animals or humans. There's no evidence, there's nothing stated in the fossil record. It's not like someone wrote something in the mud that became, sandstone. I was here until I evolved into that over there. It's just you have these fossils and people, especially people who are hoping to become rich and famous. I'm not trying to insult all of their integrities. I'm just saying there is people have a desire to want to find, the missing links so that they can become published and they can make more money and they can get more grant money from the government. And they say, well, this creature evolved into this, which evolved into that, and actually there's no proof for it. We have a number of skulls and replicas at Apologetics Press, and Dr. Jeff Miller, who's there, will show you. Look at all these differences among the humankind. We got a friend of mine at work the other day got some hats for us. He got a hat, and I got a hat. But, my hat's bigger than his hat. You know why? Because he's got a peanut head, and I got an egg head. And so, when we die one day, if someone were to, if they were to see our skulls, well, his skull is going to be smaller than my skull. Some people have a different jawbone, line. That doesn't mean that you're you look around this room, there's a lot of differences. You look around the entire world, there's a lot of differences in the skeletal sizes of human beings. And maybe even some of the structures are different for whatever reason, but we're all human beings. It's been a pleasure to deal with you, to talk to you and teach this first hour together. I went a little bit over time, so I'll leave it with David. Take about a 10-minute break and be back in here for the next session, which we're going to be talking about one of the poster children of dinosaurs, of evolution, which is dinosaurs. Thank you for your kind attention.